You and I are going back to a town that served cruelty with a Sunday sermon. So when Gideon Locke, a trapper, stinking of pine pitch and old blood, booted his way into the general store to buy a blind widow's debts, those townspeople didn't just whisper, they outright laughed. Folks reckoned a wild high country loner and a ruined pioneer woman would freeze before the first snowfall. They figured wrong. Dead wrong. See, they had no idea what kind of iron hid behind her blind eyes. Pine Bluffs itself was built on cheap mud and broken promises. It sat in the valley like a rotting tooth, choked by jagged, rocky peaks that killed the sun by 3 in the afternoon. Gideon Locke despised every inch of it. He only left the high timberline twice a year, dragged down by the stubborn need for coffee, salt, and black powder. He was a mountain of a man, broad, silent. His buckskins were stained black from bear grease and harsh winters, while a wild beard swallowed his face whole. He stalked through the busy frontier streets with heavy, heavy steps. Townfolks scrambled aside. Civilized society had no love for mountain men. They happily took their trapping pelts and hard coin, but hated the raw wilderness they tracked inside. Gideon shoved open the thick oak door of Cobb's Mercantile. Inside the air hung thick choking on cured tobacco, wet wool, and cheap kerosene. He slammed his bundle of prime beaver and fox skins onto the wooden counter. That heavy thud rattled the room. Elias Cobb, a bony shopkeeper sporting a nervous eye twitch, started clawing through the furs with fast, greedy fingers. Right then, Gideon caught a sound, a slow, steady tapping. He turned to look. Back in the shadows, beside the stacked flour and dried beans, stood a lone woman. She wore a threadbare gray shawl that did absolutely nothing to stop the bitter mountain draft, yet she stood rigid and tall. Her right hand gripped a smooth, peeled hickory cane. Gideon knew of Eleanor Valera, even if they had never traded words before. We all know how western town rumors spread. Her husband Thomas drowned in the icy Snake River 3 years back, leaving her stranded with a worthless patch of rocky dirt just outside town limits. A harsh fever stole her vision a year later. Now the town felt sorry at first, but pity always runs dry out west. When the sympathy faded, plain old irritation took over. She became a stubborn liability, a heavy burden on the good Christian charity of Pine Bluffs. Standing right in her face was Hiram Gable, the bank manager. Gable was soft-sweating in an expensive wool suit and wearing a permanent sneer. "I'm warning you for the last time, Eleanor." Gable practically shouted it. He wanted the whole store to hear. "Your grace period died in October. You owe $60 on that deed. You're broke." "The bank reclaims the dirt." Eleanor didn't even flinch. Her pale eyes, clouded thick like frosted glass, stared dead ahead. "I have $20, Mr. Gable. I just sold off my very last laying hens. I only need 1 more month to secure the rest." "Secure it how?" Gable laughed, glancing around the room to make sure his audience was paying attention. A few cowards by the Cracker Barrel snickered loudly. "You planning to knit us sweaters? You can't even see the string." "We're done here, Eleanor. Pack up for the church cellar. Reverend Miller promised to lay out a dirty cot for you. That's where you belong." Eleanor's knuckles went bone white around her hickory cane. She refused to cry, never even raised her voice. She just stood tall, eating the humiliation. "That land is mine. Thomas and I bought it free and clear before you hiked the taxes. There is good timber up there." "Timber a blind woman can't chop," Gable snapped back. "I'm filing those papers at noon." Gideon stood watching. An ugly, familiar anger coiled inside his chest. Here's where you and I see how civilized men operate. They use paper and numbers to crush folks, hiding behind ledgers to keep their own hands perfectly clean. He glared over at Eleanor. She looked pale, her skin weathered raw by the prairie wind, yet her jaw was locked in pure, unyielding defiance. She was absolutely terrified. Gideon caught the tiny, nervous shake in her left shoulder, but she stubbornly refused to bow down. Gideon turned back to the front counter. Cobb was finalizing his math. $85 for the whole lot, Locke, Cobb mumbled nervously, wiping his sweaty hands on his apron. Gideon didn't even reach for the cash. He just turned and marched across those uneven wooden floorboards toward the flour sacks. The heavy, booming thud of his boots killed every snicker by the Cracker Barrel. Gather round, folks. Picture this town banker puffing his chest while a massive mountain man loomed. "You're in my light, Locke," Gable stammered, losing that fake bravery he had shown the widow. Gideon just ignored him, studying Eleanor. $60 pays the debt. Gideon rumbled his voice like crushed gravel. Eleanor tilted her head toward him. She gripped her cane tight. "Who's speaking?" "Gideon Locke." She swallowed hard. "Yes, Mr. Locke. $60 clears the county tax and bank penalty." Gideon turned toward the trembling banker. "Write the receipt." Gable blinked. "Now see here, Locke, this is a municipal matter. Don't waste good trapping money on a lost cause. That frontier land is just rocks and mud." "Didn't ask for a survey," Gideon muttered, stepping half a pace forward. He never raised a hand, but his pure mountain man size made Gable scramble a step backward. "I said, write the receipt." Gable dug into his coat, fetching a ledger and pencil nub. He scribbled real fast, ripped the page out, and handed it over. Gideon strolled to the counter, grabbed $60 in notes, and dropped them into Gable's shaking palm. "Done," Gideon said. Gable scurried right out the trading post door, bell clanging like wild. The room went dead silent. Gideon walked back to Eleanor. He held out the paper, realized she was blind, and tucked it into her shawl pocket. "Why did you do that?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady but heavy with frontier suspicion. She was no fool. Out west, men don't give away $60 for free. "Need a winter camp," Gideon lied straight up. He had a ridge cabin already. "Your land sits riverside. I'll trade labor for shelter. I chop wood, fix the roof, you keep the deed." Eleanor's blind eyes studied him like she could read a man's soul right through the breeze. "I don't need a savior, Mr. Locke." "Good," Gideon grunted, "because I ain't one. Just a man who hates Hiram Gable, deal or not." She quietly weighed her tough options. Freeze in a church cellar? Or host a dangerous trapper? She stuck out her calloused hand. "We have a deal." Come Friday, the gossips in Pine Bluffs had themselves a brand new joke. The rugged savage and the blind widow were getting hitched. This wasn't no fairy tale romance, folks. Just pure, cold frontier survival logistics. Reverend Miller, a hard-faced preacher with a mighty judgmental streak, swore no unmarried couple would share a homestead on his watch, even for a strict business arrangement. He threatened to make the local sheriff run Gideon right out of town. Gideon couldn't care less about church morals, but he respected a sheriff's loaded rifle. Eleanor just wanted her land safe. So they stood in that drafty Methodist church, swapping vows they didn't really mean. The pews weren't empty either. Nosy townsfolk packed the back, whispering behind covered mouths. When Gideon slipped a plain iron wedding band, bought off the blacksmith for 5 cents onto Eleanor's finger, a harsh laugh barked from the back. Jeb Collins' town drunk. Gideon's hand jumped toward his heavy hunting blade, but Eleanor's fingers clamped onto his wrist. Her pioneer grip was shockingly strong. "Let them laugh," she whispered. Blind eyes locked dead on the altar. "Breath is cheap. Firewood is expensive." They walked right out, without shaking the preacher's hand. Gideon loaded up Eleanor's few humble belongings into the back of a rented buckboard wagon. They rode a mile out of town, following a muddy, rutted river trail. The silence between them felt thick as molasses. Gideon handled the horses, scanning the tree line by pure habit. Eleanor sat rigid, hands folded tight in her lap. She never asked where they were. She just listened to the shallow water rushing, feeling the wind shift as they rolled through the thick pine brake. She knew exactly where she was. They pulled up, and let me tell you, Gideon just stared. Gather round. Hiram Gable wasn't entirely wrong. The place was a pure ruin. That main cabin barely stood upright, The roof sagged heavy with wet leaves and deep pioneer rot. Front door hung by one rusted hinge. Down on the muddy riverbank sat a massive, half-built timber frontier frame. Looked exactly like the rotting bones of some giant dead beast. Thomas Valera tried building a grist mill before the river swallowed him. "It's a total mess," Gideon stated, right flat. No sense sugarcoating the ugly truth to a widow who couldn't even see. "I know," Eleanor fired right back. She grabbed her cane, climbing down from that wagon before Gideon could even offer his hand. He just unhitched the tired horses and tied them up fast. When he turned around, Eleanor was already marching toward those skeletal mill remains. Her wooden cane swept in wide, steady arcs across dead grass and river mud. "Watch your step!" Gideon hollered, jogging up. "There's loose timber everywhere, with rusty nails sticking out." "I know where the timber is, Gideon," she said, first time she ever bothered using the man's given name. She didn't slow her pace once. She marched right up to the massive support beam of that unfinished mill, pressing her bare hand flat against the rough wood. Gideon just stood close by, crossing his arms. He reckoned the woman was grieving, remembering the dead husband who failed this job. He decided to let her have peace. He turned his eyes back toward the cabin. "I'll patch that roof before sundown," Gideon offered. "Get a warm fire going inside." "It drops below freezing tonight. Leave the roof," Eleanor told him straight. Gideon paused. "You want to sleep under leaks? That cabin is a temporary shelter." Eleanor spoke again, her voice losing that defensive bark, turning into quiet, raw intensity. She turned her head his way. "Thomas didn't know what he was doing. Good husband, sure, but a mighty terrible carpenter. He laid this mill foundation way too close to the rising river floodline. That's why it rots." Gideon frowned deep. "Then what's the point?" "Picture this with me." Eleanor reached into her thick wool skirt, pulling out a heavy twine ball. "Come here," she commanded. Gideon stepped right over. "Take the end of this string." He took it. "Walk exactly 15 paces inland away from the water," she ordered. "Tell me when you hit that solid granite outcropping." Gideon narrowed his weathered eyes, but he turned and walked. His long strides ate up the frontier dirt. 14, 15. His boot struck mossy rock. "I'm here." "Tie the string to the rock base. Pull it tight." Gideon tied it. He looked back. Eleanor was moving mighty fast now. She hitched her end of the twine to a rusted iron wheel hub her husband left buried in mud. She reached into her skirt pocket again, pulling out a second, much thicker spool of string. For the next whole hour, Gideon stood watching in dead silence. He didn't chop a single log, didn't fix no roof. He just watched a blind woman map out an entire acre of debris-littered frontier land using different ropes and strings. She measured every inch by paces, arm lengths, and the rushing sound of river against rock. She drove wooden stakes into the dirt with a rusted mallet, finding the stake heads by pure instinct, touch, and muscle memory. By the time that old sun dipped behind the western ridge, casting long bruised shadows across the valley, that muddy stretch between mill and cabin was covered in a complex web of intersecting pioneer ropes. Gideon finally walked up as she hammered the very last stake. She was breathing heavy, forehead shining with sweat, despite the western chill. "What is this?" Gideon asked, staring at that massive twine grid. Eleanor stood tall, wiping her muddy hands on her apron. She didn't look broken anymore. She looked downright terrifying and focused. "This is our new foundation," she declared. "The settlement thinks I'm just a helpless widow crying over useless timber, but I listened to every single mistake Thomas made. I felt every warped board. I spent 3 years in the dark calculating Angle's stone weight, the exact pitch for that waterwheel. You and I better believe she meant it. Gather round, folks." She reached out and grabbed his thick forearm. Her grip was pure iron. "Folks mocked you for taking me in Gideon Locke," she told him, "but they have no earthly idea what I've been designing in the dark. I ain't building some flimsy shack. I am building a sawmill, the only one for 50 miles, and you are going to help me raise it." Gideon stared hard at that tangled web of guide ropes, absolutely flawless. He was looking at a blueprint for a massive, perfectly sound building. He just stared down at this blind woman standing in the freezing mud. For the first time in 10 long years, old Gideon smiled. "All right, Mrs. Locke." He rolled up his sleeves. "Where do we start?" Pretty soon, the heavy rhythm of his axe became the thumping heartbeat of that entire valley. Work kicked off before dawn, frost still painting the dead grass white, and it never quit until the moon sat high enough to throw long, cold shadows. Gideon swung a double-bitted felling axe with brutal, machine-like rhythm. He never just hacked at the timber. He studied the grain, found the sweet spot, and buried steel into pine with bone-rattling pioneer strength. Every single falling pine shook that muddy frontier earth. Each crack rolled like thunder clear down to Pine Bluffs. Folks heard it plain, standing out on the wooden boardwalks in front of Cobb's Mercantile. Hands jammed deep in heavy wool pockets, they just listened to those distant rhythmic thuds. Folks chuckled at first, figured the gruff mountain man was just chopping up winter firewood, assumed he was slapping together a rough lean-to for the blind woman before heavy frontier snows buried them alive. But the ringing axe never stopped. 2 solid weeks passed. Up on that rocky ridge, the whole homestead was transforming. Gideon dragged those massive pine trunks right down to the riverbank using 2 strong draft horses. Soon as those raw logs were stripped bare, Eleanor stepped up. She wasn't inside knitting by the fire. No, she dragged heavy sawhorses right out into the freezing mud. Gideon hoisted a timber onto the stands, and Eleanor slid her bare, calloused fingers across the rough bark to read it. She felt for knots, hidden rot, or any natural bend in the wood. Gripping a heavy 2-handled draw knife, she started peeling that log. She worked entirely by feel and the sound of steel. That sharp pioneer steel shaved the bark off in long, curling ribbons. She gauged exactly how deep to bite by the blade's heavy resistance and the high pitch of the scraping noise alone. For a square joint, Gideon swung a broadaxe, following deep, straight grooves Eleanor had scored into the rough timber, using a heavy iron nail. "Now you and I know the frontier." They barely spoke. Words wasted breath, and out there, breath was heat. Gideon quickly learned to trust her hands way more than his own eyes. If he chopped a mortise hole, Eleanor would walk right over, kneel in the freezing muck, and slide her bare fingers into the carved pocket. "A 1/4 inch too shallow on the left," she muttered one bitter afternoon, pulling her freezing hand back. Her knuckles were cracked and bleeding from the bitter cold, but she never even flinched. "That tenon snaps under the roof's weight if it ain't sittin' flush." Gideon didn't argue one bit. He swallowed his pride, picked up his chisel, shaved exactly a 1/4 inch off that left side, and respectfully stepped back. Eleanor felt the wood again, gave one single nod. Good. By the 3rd week of November, the bare skeleton of that new sawmill finally rose. This wasn't the rotting, flimsy frame her late husband tried to build. This thing was a fortress. Primary support columns stood 2 feet thick, sunk deep into the solid granite outcropping Eleanor mapped out with her string. Every joint was locked down tight with heavy oak pegs she carved by the firelight every single night. Those townsfolk couldn't ignore the racket anymore. Curiosity was eating them alive. On a biting Tuesday afternoon, Caleb Fowler rode up that rutted wagon trail. Caleb was a green kid with more money than sense. His daddy owned the town livery stable, sitting atop a mighty fine roan gelding. His neck wrapped in thick wool, he pulled up right near the property line and just stared. Gideon was 50 feet up in the sky, straddling a huge crossbeam, driving an oak peg home with a heavy wooden maul. Eleanor stood below, working a complicated block and tackle rig Gideon set up to haul those heavy western timbers upwards. Young Caleb spurred his horse a few steps closer. Picture that sight with me. He saw the massive pioneer structure, the pure engineering genius. His jaw just dropped. Picture this. Caleb hollered over the roaring river. "What in the hell are you building?" Gideon just kept swinging that heavy maul. The mountain man never even glanced down. Eleanor just turned her head toward Caleb's shouting. She kept a white-knuckled grip on that thick hemp hoist rope. "A business, Mr. Fowler," Eleanor declared, her voice cutting through the freezing wind. Caleb sneered, his frontier arrogance returning. "A business. The bank owns this dirt. In 3 weeks, Eleanor, you're building Hiram Gable a barn." "The taxes are paid?" she replied, dead level. "Taxes, maybe. But Gable claims your dead husband took a private loan against the deed. $80, due December 1st. Caleb leaned forward in his saddle, soaking up the thrill of delivering bad news. Gable kept quiet at the store, figured a blind widow could never read a contract anyway. Suddenly, the heavy thumping of Gideon's maul stopped. The dead silence that followed felt heavy and dangerous. Gideon slowly lowered his hammer. He stared down at Caleb. The mountain man's eyes were pitch black, completely stripped of any human warmth. Caleb's horse shifted around, sensing violence in the bitter air. "You tell Hiram Gable." Gideon growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble, shaking the very timber, "that if he steps foot on this claim before December 1st, I will nail his boots to the boardwalk while he is wearing them." Caleb swallowed hard. That ugly sneer vanished. He yanked his reins hard left and spurred that horse back, towards town, kicking up flying chunks of frozen mud. Gideon climbed down from the wooden scaffolding. He dropped his heavy tools into the dirt and looked toward Eleanor. She was shaking, and not from the bitter cold. "Is it true?" Gideon asked quietly. Eleanor dropped the thick rope, her weary shoulders sagging down. "Thomas signed a lot of papers before he passed. He was desperate. Gable probably kept that private loan a secret just to humiliate me." $80. Gideon stared out at the freezing water. He had already spent his trapping money on taxes and iron mill fittings. They had exactly $4 left, hidden in a tin can beneath the floorboards. "I will pack my things," Eleanor whispered. Pure defeat finally cracked her voice. "You have worked hard, Gideon. Take the horses. Take the tools. Just leave me here." Gideon walked right over to her. He didn't offer empty comfort. He offered harsh reality. "We need a main axle for the waterwheel," Gideon growled gruffly. "Solid oak thick as a whiskey barrel. I spotted some old-growth timber 3 miles up the ridge. We cut it tomorrow." Eleanor raised her sightless eyes toward him. "Did you hear me? We have 0 money. Gable will take the mill." "Let him try," Gideon said. He simply turned around and picked up his broadaxe. "Now, grab the other end of this rope. The sun is dropping fast." The freezing dark moved in like a hungry predator. Now, you and I know frontier cold. It didn't just freeze mud. It sucked moisture from the air, making every breath feel like inhaling shattered glass. They found that mighty oak tree 3 miles up the snowy ridge. It was an absolute monster. Centuries-old roots clawing deep into the mountain rock like gnarled, twisted fingers. Chopping it down took 2 agonizing days. Stripping bark and dragging it to the river behind straining draft horses stole 3 more. By the time they finally wrestled that massive oak timber onto the riverbank, late November had arrived. The Snake River was icing up at the edges while dark. Violent water churned wildly straight through the center channel. Now listen, they had to set that main axle for the waterwheel. It was the absolute deadliest part of this entire frontier build. That oak axle had to hang perfectly level above the rushing rapids, resting right in those carved stone cradles Gideon had chiseled into the bank. It weighed over 1,000 pounds. Gideon rigged up a sheer legs derrick, 2 massive timber poles lashed tight at the top, leaning out over the raging water, rigged with heavy block and tackle pulleys. Eleanor stood back from the slick, muddy riverbank, her hands desperately gripping the tail end of that hoist rope. Rope friction burned right through her leather work gloves, but she dug her boots deep into the frozen earth. Tension. Gideon bellowed out over the roaring rapids. Eleanor leaned hard backward. throwing every ounce of her body weight against that heavy rope. The iron pulleys shrieked in protest. Slowly, painfully, the massive oak axle lifted straight off the freezing mud. Gideon was down in that icy river water, waist deep. Picture this. His buckskins were soaked, freezing dead to his skin. He had to wrangle that hanging timber right into the stone cradles. The savage river battered him, fighting to rip his legs out from under him. His lips turned blue. His jaw clamped shut in pure, brutal frontier grit. Lower it. Gideon hollered, driving his icy shoulder hard against that swinging oak timber. 2 inches. Eleanor let that rope slip exactly 2 inches. She felt the violent shake of that heavy wood singing right down through the hemp line. Then the iron ring at the top of that derrick groaned. A sharp, terrifying crack rang out across the icy water. One of those thick, lashing ropes keeping the rig together just gave out under the bitter cold and heavy weight. The whole rig shifted hard to the right. That oak axle violently swung sideways. It caught Gideon dead square in the chest. The breath blasted right out of his lungs. The blow sent him flying backward into the freezing, churning black river. Gideon Eleanor screamed. Stick with me here. The sickening crunch of shifting timber and that heavy splash meant real trouble. The rope yanked forward with terrifying power as the massive load dropped. The raw friction shredded right through her gloves, ripping the skin off her palms. If she dropped it, that axle would smash down, crushing Gideon beneath the freezing tide. She held her ground. Eleanor hit her knees in the deep mud, wrapping that line around her forearms, digging her leather boots deep into the earth. The muscles in her back and shoulders screamed as the full heft of that 1,000-pound timber fought like a wild stallion. Blood soaked through her ruined gloves, freezing instantly to the coarse rope. Gideon. She hollered again, her voice ripping her throat raw. Down under the icy rapids, Gideon was drowning. The freezing chill paralyzed his lungs. The wicked current dragged him over jagged rocks. He fought blindly, his heavy pioneer boots anchoring him down. His hand broke the surface, thrashing wildly against the ice. He felt the rough, hard bark of that suspended oak timber. Eleanor was holding the line. Now you and I know that takes guts. A blind 90-pound woman was holding 1,000 pounds of dead weight by pure pioneer willpower. Gideon grabbed hold. He forced his head above the black water, gasping a ragged, agonizing breath. He hooked his strong arm right over the timber, battling the river. "Hold it," he roared, coughing up bitter river water. He hauled his massive frame up the side of that hanging log. The wooden derrick groaned, leaning dangerously close to total collapse. Gideon scrambled along the rough timber, reached that stone cradle, and threw his full weight against the end of the axle. "Drop it!" he yelled. Eleanor let that rope go. The massive oak timber slammed hard down into the stone cradles with a deafening, thunderous boom. Freezing water and ice sprayed high into the air. The axle seated absolutely perfectly. The iron ring up top shattered, sending wooden poles crashing uselessly into the roaring river. Gideon dragged his heavy bones out of the freezing water and collapsed onto the muddy riverbank. He lay flat on his back, staring up at the gray, unforgiving frontier sky, his chest heaving violently. Just a heartbeat later, Eleanor was right beside him. She dropped to her knees, her hands frantically patting down his chest and face, feeling around for broken bones. Her breath came in ragged, terrified sobs. "I'm whole," Gideon choked out, grabbing her wrists. "I'm whole." Then he felt the warm stickiness coating her hands. He sat up, pushing through the agonizing, bitter cold, and pulled her palms right toward his face. Those leather gloves were shredded entirely. Her hands were nothing but a mess of torn skin and raw meat. Gideon didn't utter a single word. He stood up, his joints screaming in protest, gathered Eleanor up in his arms, and carried her to the cabin. He kicked the heavy door shut against the howling wind. The fire in the stone hearth was burning awfully low. He set her gently on the narrow wooden cot and stripped off his freezing buckskins before hypothermia took hold, wrapping himself up in a heavy wool blanket. He found the bottle of cheap frontier whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes and poured a generous splash over a clean rag. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed. "This is going to burn," he warned quietly. Eleanor set her jaw hard. She held her hands out, palms facing up. Gideon pressed that whiskey-soaked rag right into her open wounds. Eleanor flinched, a sharp hiss escaping her clenched teeth. But she didn't pull away. Gideon wrapped her hands carefully in clean strips of linen. His massive, rough pioneer hands were startlingly gentle. "Listen here." The silence in that cabin hung thick, broken only by the spitting fire and a howling frontier wind ripping at the newly patched roof. "You saved my life," Gideon said. Wasn't no sweet talk, just cold frontier fact. Eleanor kept those blind, unseeing eyes fixed right on the flames. "You're the sole man in this whole valley who treats me like I ain't broken." "Wasn't about to let the river steal you too." Gideon finally looked at her. I mean, really looked. He took in the fierce, stubborn set of her jaw and the deep, weary lines carved right around those sightless eyes of hers. This mountain man had spent his whole life fleeing from folks and crowded towns, running from the messy traps of human frailty. He chose the high country because those jagged peaks were brutally honest. The wild killed you with freezing cold, and fangs not deceitful paper ledgers. But watching Eleanor sit in that dim light, ruined hands, yet a totally unbroken spirit, something downright terrifying hit him. He no longer wanted to retreat to the high timberline. "We got ourselves an axle," Eleanor whispered, dead tired and sinking into the pillows. "Just need $80. Gideon reached over, dragging the heavy quilt over her frail shoulders. "Just rest," Gideon told her softly. "I'll handle Hiram Gable." He slipped out 2 hours before the morning sun. Temperatures took a nosedive, overnight trapping the valley in a bitter white freeze. That wagon rut mud froze solid as cast iron. He left the horses behind and just walked. Slung over his shoulder was his Hawken rifle, a heavy percussion cap piece forged right down in St. Louis, 50-inch octagonal barrel. Curly maple stock worn smooth by years of grit and mountain sweat, double triggers snapping sharp like winter ice. Ain't just a tool, friend. It was his whole survival. Dropped charging grizzlies up in the bighorns and kept him breathing through brutal winters that buried lesser men. Easily worth $150 to the right buyer. Gideon hiked into Pine Bluffs as the morning sun topped the eastern ridge, throwing long, pale shadows down Main Street while the frontier town slowly woke. Chimneys puffed gray wood smoke into the biting air. He skipped right past Cobb's Mercantile. He marched straight to a squat building at the boardwalk's edge. A wooden anvil sign hung right over the doorway. Jeremiah Reed, the local frontier gunsmith and heavy blacksmith, was already tending his forge, pumping coals to life with thick leather bellows. The smith looked up as Gideon shadowed the doorway. That thick soot-stained smith had cautious eyes. Wiping his hands on a filthy apron, he nodded. "Locke?" Reed grunted. "Down from the ridge early. Broke a mainspring." Gideon stayed quiet. He stepped to the bench, unslung that beautiful Hawken, and rested it on the scarred timber. The steel barrel shone dull and freezing in the lantern glow. Reed quit pumping those bellows. He wandered over, his sharp eyes glued to that legendary rifle. He reached out, pausing a brief second before sliding a rough thumb across the brass patchbox. He knew exactly what he held. Any man out west who knew guns recognized a true, authentic Hawken immediately. "That is one beautiful piece of murder," Reed whispered. He looked at Gideon. "What do you want for it?" $80, Gideon replied. "Gold or banknotes, no script." Reed squinted. He knew that Western rifle was worth nearly double. He also figured Gideon Locke wouldn't ever sell his main gun unless he was dead desperate. Suddenly, town rumors about the widow's debts made sense. "I'll give you 60. Reed tested, tapping the stock. Hard winter approaching. Cash is scarce. Gideon just grabbed the barrel. 80 or I hike this to the Carson City assayer next spring. Reed sighed heavy, seeing this tough trapper wasn't about to haggle today. The smith dropped to an iron strongbox, turned a key he kept dangling around his neck, and counted out 4 $20 gold eagles, stacking them on the scarred bench. Gideon swept up the coins, never glancing at his rifle again. He turned into the freezing street. With the bank closed for an hour, Gideon waited on the opposite boardwalk. Tell you what, he stood perfectly still, ignoring that biting wind, his massive arms crossed tight against the cold. Folks scurried past, giving the big man plenty of room. Everyone stared at that empty leather rifle sling strapped across his chest. Right at 8, Hiram Gable swaggered down the boardwalk. The banker wore heavy beaver fur and a bowler hat, cheeks biting pink from that bitter chill. He unlocked those bank doors, stepping inside and propping them wide to air out the dusty stench of his vault. Gideon walked right in after him. Gable just settled behind his mahogany desk when heavy boots made him flinch. That smug frontier pride vanished from the banker's face. "Locke?" Gable stammered, pulling a thick ledger close like a shield. "We ain't open for business yet, and that Valera homestead deadline ain't till tomorrow." "You ain't got the coin. I've already drawn up the foreclosure." Gideon stepped right up to the mahogany. He didn't raise his voice one bit. Didn't need to. He reached into his duster, dug out 4 gold eagles, and dropped them down. The heavy clatter of that western gold echoed off the plaster. $80, Gideon muttered. "Write the paper. Mark the loan paid." Gable just stared at that gold. He looked up at Gideon, hunting for some kind of frontier trick. Finding absolutely none, his pale face flushed an angry red. He wanted that acreage. He truly wanted to break that poor widow. "This changes nothing," Gable spat, snatching his pen with trembling fingers. "She can't run a lumber mill blind. You're just delaying it. You'll both starve." "Write it," Gideon growled, leaning his massive frame over the desk. Gable quickly scribbled out a receipt, stamped the ink, and shoved it across. Gideon folded the paper, walking out silent. "Come with me back to the homestead now," where the winter sun sat high but weak. Eleanor waited out by the fire pit, a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders. Her hands were still wrapped thick from terrible rope burns, resting helpless in her lap. She turned as Gideon's heavy boots crunched across the frozen mud, listening, real close. "You're back," she whispered into the wind. "The debt is cleared," Gideon told her. He pulled out the deed and pressed it into those bandaged palms. "Gable won't bother you no more." Eleanor ran a thumb across the rough paper. She didn't crack a smile. Her brow furrowed. She listened, a heavy silence stretching out. "When you walk, the brass on your rifle sling usually rattles," she said real quiet. "I don't hear it, Gideon. Where is your Hawken rifle?" Gideon stared up at the skeletal mill frame. He looked at that massive oak axle they nearly died setting. He felt bare without the iron weight on his shoulder. "It's safe," Gideon lied. Eleanor stood. She walked straight toward him, stopping only when her boots bumped right into his. Reaching up with wrapped hands, she felt for his shoulder, tracing her fingers down his chest, until she found the empty leather. She let her hands fall. Those blind eyes locked onto his face with piercing aim. "You sold your life insurance for a blind woman's rotting wood?" she whispered softly. Her voice cracked, losing its frontier iron. "I bought a partner," Gideon corrected her rough-voiced. "You and I know he meant it." Stepping past, he grabbed an iron crowbar. "We got a waterwheel to build. Daylight is burning." They toiled right through the darkest, bitterest days of December. The winter cold became a living enemy, threatening to crack iron and snap brittle pine lumber. With wrapped hands, Eleanor couldn't swing a hammer, but her mind stayed sharper than any broadaxe. Sitting by the frozen river in a thick buffalo robe Gideon provided, she directed every single swing of his hammer. They were building that mighty waterwheel. It was an undershot design built to catch the brutal rushing current of the Snake River. Gideon spent forever cutting and shaping 24 massive wooden paddles. Every single paddle needed a perfect angle, notched into the wheel's rim with agonizing precision. By the end of week 2, the whole town's curiosity had twisted into ugly resentment. You and I know folks in Pine Bluffs hated being wrong. They had bet heavily on the widow's ruin. Gather round for a frontier tale. That sturdy sawmill finally cast its shadow across the riverbank. It stood as a monument to local greed. And on one pitch-black Thursday night, that bitter frontier resentment came knocking right at their cabin door. Gideon was fast asleep inside. The cabin stretched out on a bedroll right near the hearth. The fire had faded down to glowing red embers, while Eleanor slept soundly over in the narrow bed. Out in the dark, a dry twig snapped. Gideon's eyes flashed open. He stayed perfectly still, knowing better than to reach for a missing rifle. Instead, he slipped his hand under the rough blanket and grabbed the bone handle of his hunting knife. Then came another noise. The heavy, dull thud of a boot hitting frozen mud near the timber mill. Gideon quietly stood up. He slipped out the back door into that biting pioneer cold, fading straight into the deep shadows cast by those massive stacks of cut timber. Down by the water, 3 figures huddled around the mill's main axle. They held a lantern with the shutter mostly closed, throwing just a faint streak of yellow light against the wooden beams. One outlaw gripped a massive iron sledgehammer. Another carried a rusty tin reeking of coal oil. "Just smash up those main gear teeth," a gravelly voice whispered in the dark. That was Jeb Collins, his breath absolutely stinking of cheap whiskey. "Then soak all these support beams." "One quick fire and Gable buys this land for pennies." "Keep quiet and hold the light," a second man grumbled, lifting the heavy sledgehammer high. He never finished that swing. Gideon stepped out of the pitch black like a waking frontier nightmare. He snatched the sledgehammer right out of the air, with his left hand stopping it dead. The thug gasped, staring straight up into Gideon's cold eyes. Gideon smashed the heavy brass pommel of his hunting knife right into the man's temple. The fella crumpled instantly, hitting the frozen mud in total silence. Jeb Collins stumbled back, completely dropping his lantern. Glass shattered, and the oil sparked for a second before dying in the snow. Jeb desperately pawed for a revolver hidden in his coat. Gideon crossed that gap in one long stride. He snatched Jeb by the throat, hoisted the drunk right off his boots, and pinned him against the oak axle. Jeb choked and gargled wildly, scratching at Gideon's rock-solid arm. Now you and I know cowardice well. That third man took one look, turned tail, and sprinted blindly into the dark timber, leaving his partners. Gideon leaned right into Jeb's terrified face. "You tell Gable," Gideon whispered softly, his deep voice dripping with pure, lethal anger. "If even one spark touches this wood, or a single gear breaks, I am coming down to Pine Bluffs. I won't need a knife. I'll snap his neck with my bare hands. Not if you get me." Jeb nodded his head like crazy eyes wide with terror. Gideon dumped him into the muck. Jeb scrambled away, hauled his knocked-out buddy up by the collar, and staggered off into the dark wilderness, crying. Just 2 days later, that western sawmill was finally finished. It was a grim, gray morning, and the river was absolutely jammed with drifting ice. The giant wooden waterwheel hung totally suspended above the rushing current. The heavy sluice gate was locked down tight, blocking the freezing water. Inside the new mill house, Eleanor stood proudly by the main drive gear. Her hands were finally out of those bandages covered in raw red frontier scars, and resting gently right on those giant wooden teeth. She could feel the wild anticipation in the air. Out by the gate, Gideon stood tall, gripping a solid iron pry bar. "Ready?" Gideon hollered loudly over the roaring rush of the river. "Pull the gate!" Eleanor yelled right back. Gideon shoved that iron bar hard under the wooden locking wedge, and threw his entire weight down. The heavy timber shrieked. That wedge shot free. The gate dropped open, and a violent wave of black, icy water blasted down the wooden chute. It hammered into the wooden paddles of that water wheel with the sheer raw power of a runaway freight train. The whole building groaned, and the dirt ground beneath their boots shuddered violently. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The stiff, frozen grease and the crushing weight of that heavy machinery battled the river. Suddenly, the giant oak axle let loose a deafening crack, just like a booming cannon. Inside the mill, Eleanor gasped loudly, yanking her hands away as the massive gear jerked. The wheel turned. It moved real slow at first, just a brutal, agonizing grind of heavy wood against wood. You see, the river always wins. That giant wheel finally started turning with a steady, unstoppable rhythm. The heavy paddles whipped the icy water into white froth. Inside the mill house, the true mechanical heart of Eleanor's frontier design finally woke up. That iron drive gear caught the secondary shaft. Listen close, friend. A wild racket of clacking iron and grinding gears echoed through that cavernous mill. That massive log sled finally lurched forward along its tracks. Old Gideon stepped into the mill house. He watched that huge circular saw blade, bought with his very last trapping dime, spin up to full speed. Soon it became a terrifying blur of singing frontier steel. Eleanor just stood right in the center of that roaring noise. The sheer volume was deafening, but that woman never even covered her ears. Instead, she reached out, pressing her badly scarred hand flat against the vibrating oak wall of the mill. She felt all that raw mechanical power humming right through the timber. She felt the steady, flawless rhythm of those heavy gears she had calculated completely in the dark. A slow, truly brilliant smile finally broke across her face. First time Gideon ever saw her flash a real smile. "Throw a log on the carriage, Mr. Locke," Eleanor hollered over the roar of the running saw. "We have timber to cut!" The scream of that massive circular saw blade biting deep into old-growth pine became the valley's new anthem. It was a violent, downright beautiful noise. It completely drowned out the whistling wind and the roaring river. Gideon just kept working the heavy iron levers of that old carriage sled. He fed a 12-foot lodgepole pine right into those spinning steel teeth. Sawdust exploded everywhere, making a thick, sweet cloud of raw pine sap and fresh timber. That blade sliced right through the log with hungry efficiency, spitting out a perfectly straight, rough-sawn board onto the exit rollers. Eleanor stood right at the end of the line. The heavy noise was absolute, isolating her in a steady world of vibration. She reached out. Her heavily scarred hands found that warm, freshly cut lumber. She ran her fingertips along the broad face, then down the sharp 90-degree edge. She didn't need eyes to judge the craftsmanship. That cut was perfectly uniform. The thickness was dead exact. The board never bowed or twisted. Her frontier mill geometry was simply flawless. Gideon locked the log carriage down and walked over, his rugged face heavily coated in pale yellow sawdust. He watched Eleanor trace the rich grain of the wood. Her face held a fierce, very quiet triumph. She turned toward the heavy thud of his muddy boots. "It is straight," she stated, raising her voice over the idling hum of the sawmill. "Quarter-inch tolerance at the absolute most. Better than the fancy steam mills in Carson City," Gideon confirmed. He grabbed that fresh board and tossed it onto the growing stack outside. "We have 50 boards cut. Give it another week. We will have a mountain." "We do not need a mountain," Eleanor replied, stepping out into the biting winter air to escape that roaring noise. "We just need a lumber buyer, and they will surely come." She was right. Now, you and I know the brutal western winter is the best salesman they could have hired. 3 days later, heavy snows collapsed the rear roof of Cobb's Mercantile. The crushing weight of that ice shattered the old joists, leaving half of Elias Cobb's dry goods completely exposed to the harsh elements. Cobb desperately needed lumber, and he needed it before the next howling blizzard ruined his inventory. Old Cobb rode up that rutted trail on a sway-backed mule, his pale face pinched with bitter cold and anxiety. He found Gideon splitting heavy cordwood near the little cabin, that heavy iron maul rising and falling in a rhythmic, terrifying display of raw frontier power. Cobb nervously cleared his throat. "Locke," he called. Gideon never broke rhythm. He brought that heavy maul straight down, splitting a thick round of oak right in half before turning to look at the nervous storekeeper. Gideon said absolutely nothing. "I need some timber," Cobb muttered, shifting uncomfortably under the mountain man's dead flat stare. 20 heavy joists, 100 feet of planking. How much? Gideon just leaned his big maul against the chopping block. "I do not sell the wood. Talk to the boss." Gideon pointed straight toward the noisy sawmill. Eleanor was sitting on a freshly cut pine stump, weaving a thick new rope from raw hemp fibers. Cobb swallowed his battered pride and walked over. Eleanor Cobb started trying hard to sound neighborly. "Terrible weather we are having. Caught a bad break. My roof caved in." Eleanor never stopped weaving. "I heard. It is a crying shame about your ruined flour sacks, Elias." Cobb bristled up slightly. "I need lumber. I know you have been cutting. I will pay fair market price, 3 cents a board foot." Eleanor paused. "Let's watch." She tilted her head, listening to the wind cut through the pines. 6 cents, she stated, dead even. Cobb nearly choked. 6? That is robbery! The steam mill at the county seat charges 4. Then ride your mule 50 miles through a frontier blizzard to the county seat and buy it for 4, Eleanor fired back. Her tone held absolutely no malice. Purely hard transactional business. But if you want that lumber today, it runs 6 cents a foot. Plus a $10 delivery fee, since Gideon has to hitch those draft horses in the snow. Cobb's face flushed purple. He glanced back at Gideon. The giant man was casually leaning on some timber, picking his teeth with a sharp splinter. Clearly, there was absolutely zero mercy coming from that direction. Cobb pictured his exposed sugar and coffee. Hundreds of dollars in mercantile inventory completely ruined if he did not patch that roof by sundown. "Fine," Cobb spat bitterly. "You will have a bank draft by noon." "No drafts," Eleanor countered. "Hard gold or silver. I do not trust Hiram Gable's paper." "And Elias?" Cobb stopped, shooting her a bitter glare she could not see. "What?" "I want that heavy winter coat from your store window." "That thick wool one with the badger fur collar. Cost that in, and Gideon rolls out in 10 minutes. Cobb practically stomped back to his mule, muttering bitter curses. Gideon ambled right over to Eleanor. He gazed down at the blind woman, a slow, proud grin spreading beneath his thick beard. She had just ruthlessly squeezed the very man who mocked her 3 months back. 6 cents? Gideon asked. "He would have paid 8, Eleanor replied calmly, picking up her rough hemp fibers again. "But I didn't want to seem greedy." Gideon just chuckled. It was a deep, gravelly rumble that actually startled the nearby horses. He reached out his massive hand, surprisingly gentle, brushing a stray timber shaving off her shoulder. "I will hitch the wagon," he told her. For the first time since taking hollow vows in that church vestibule, his quiet gesture felt like a real promise. Eleanor leaned slightly into his touch. That biting winter air suddenly felt entirely manageable to her. Picture this with me. By late February, that bitter freeze broke into a muddy, vicious thaw. The frontier rivers swelled with snowmelt, spinning their wooden water wheel with terrifying mechanical fury. That mill ran 12 hard hours a day. The stacks of cured lumber beside the riverbank grew to towering, massive proportions. Wagons from neighboring valleys braved those muddy trails, bypassing Pine Bluffs entirely just to buy direct from the Valera Locke mill. Eleanor's iron-fisted pricing and the undeniable quality of Gideon's timber cuts made them an absolute pioneer necessity. Meanwhile, Hiram Gable was suffocating. That scheming bank manager relied heavily on the frontier town's isolation to strangle its economy. He issued the loans, set the brutal rates, and ruthlessly foreclosed whenever harsh. Mountain living inevitably broke those poor settlers. But Eleanor was suddenly pumping hard currency right into the valley. Local folks were buying good lumber to build stronger barns, reinforcing their homesteads against the brutal weather, and completely bypassing Gable's exorbitant loan terms. Gable decided to stop this bleeding. On a gray Tuesday morning, Gable rode up to the timber mill. He did not come alone. He brought a hired gun from the county seat, a hulking, grim-faced deputy named Hayes, wearing a silver star pinned to a heavy buffalo coat. They dismounted by the main trail, their heavy leather boots sinking deep into the spring mud. Gideon was sharpening the main saw blade, a massive, tedious chore requiring him to file every individual iron tooth by hand. Hearing those horses approach, he calmly set his heavy iron file down and stepped right out of the mill house. Eleanor was already standing outside her cabin, her trusty hickory cane planted firmly in the wet mud. "Eleanor," Gable called out, his voice carrying a sharp edge of desperate authority. "Call off your dog. We are here on county business." Gideon did not run, but his long, steady strides closed that distance in seconds. He planted himself squarely between the corrupt banker and Eleanor. Now get this. Gideon carried no firearm, but his sheer physical mass made Deputy Hayes drop a nervous hand to the heavy Colt revolver on his hip. "State your business and get off my claim," Gideon rumbled like thunder. Gable pulled a folded legal document from his coat. "It is an injunction Locke signed by a circuit judge." "You are illegally damming a navigable waterway. Watch this." Eleanor stepped out from behind Gideon's wide back. "The Snake River isn't navigable above the gorge, Hiram. You know that. It is purely white water and jagged rocks." Gable just sneered, claimed the judge disagreed, saying the wheel broke downstream water rights. The frontier mill had to shut down for a federal survey, and since those take until spring, he figured they were out of the lumber business entirely. Gable shoved that legal paper toward Gideon. Gideon barely even blinked. Now the mountain man could barely read legal jargon, but he sure knew a trap when he saw one. He locked eyes with Deputy Hayes. "You fixin' to enforce this paper?" Gideon asked, his voice dropping an octave. Hayes drew his six-shooter. The heavy metallic click of that hammer cocking back cut right through the roar of the river. "I am. Step away from the machinery. We're chaining the sluice gate." Gideon's muscles coiled tight. He measured the distance. He could clear that gap and snap the deputy's wrist before he fired. But a stray bullet in a frontier dispute could easily hit Eleanor. "Wait," Eleanor said. Her calm voice cut through that tension like a bullwhip. She tapped her heavy cane against the mud. "Read the bottom of the injunction, deputy. You and I know how these property disputes go." Hayes frowned, keeping his gun aimed at Gideon while checking the paper Gable held. "Section 4, Township 9, Range 12. "Stop right there," Eleanor commanded. That was Thomas's original plot, the 50 acres by the road, the exact land you claimed for back taxes, Hiram. Gable smiled a truly nasty, triumphant twisting of his lips. "Exactly. The mill sits on it." "No, it doesn't," Eleanor said. She stepped forward, pointing her cane dead at a massive granite outcropping about 50 yards away. When Thomas laid the first foundation, he was a fool, built right on the mudflat. But when Gideon and I laid the new foundation, we moved it 15 paces inland. She turned her unseeing, dead-level eyes straight toward Gable. "We didn't build on Section 4. We built on Section 5, the rocky, worthless ridge nobody bothered to claim. I filed homestead papers for Section 5 the exact day after Gideon paid off my debt, sent it by courier to the land office." Gable's face went completely slack, all the blood just draining from his greedy cheeks. "The timber mill isn't on your foreclosed land, Hiram," Eleanor continued, her voice cold as winter iron. "It sits on federal land deeded to Eleanor and Gideon Locke. Your injunction covers an empty patch of mud. You have zero jurisdiction here, and absolutely no claim." Deputy Hayes looked at Gable. "Is she right?" Gable stammered, frantically eyeing the granite outcropping, then staring back at the mill. The precise, calculated placement of that massive structure suddenly made horrifying sense to him. The blind widow hadn't just moved it for structural integrity, she'd moved it to blindside him legally. "Get off my property!" Gideon growled. He took one slow, deliberate step toward the deputy. Hayes looked at the mountain man, then down at his gun. He realized how utterly useless that weapon was against a man ready to tear him apart with bare hands. Now, the sensible deputy carefully uncocked his revolver and slid it right back into its holster. "This here is a local dispute, Gable," Hayes muttered, backing slowly toward his horse. "I am not getting killed over a bad land survey." Gable stood there, paralyzed in the thick mud. He just stared at the blind widow. "Stick with me here." He finally saw the trap she had built in the dark, weaving it with patience, while the whole frontier town laughed. "You won't survive the year," Gable spat weakly, though all the real frontier venom had left his voice. "We already survived the winter," Eleanor said. She turned her back on him and headed toward the mill. "Gideon, fire up the boiler! We have timber to cut." By May, the valley bloomed, but the biggest change out west wasn't the wildflowers. It was the sheer volume of freight. That muddy wagon trail leading to the Locke claim was now a hard-packed, deeply rutted western road, pounded flat by the constant rolling of heavy lumber wagons. Pine Bluffs had fundamentally shifted. The town's true center of commerce was no longer Hiram Gable's fancy desk. It was that churning waterwheel. And you and I both know sweet justice. Folks who laughed in church now stood ankle-deep in sawdust, hats in hand, just waiting to speak with Eleanor. She handled all her business, right from a heavy oak chair Gideon had built for her, sitting proudly outside those mill doors. Now, Eleanor didn't hold grudges. Spite was a rich man's luxury, and bad for the books. But she sure didn't offer discounts. When Reverend Miller needed timber for his church, he paid the exact same price Elias Cobb did, 6 cents a foot. That preacher tried pleading for Christian charity, his tone dripping with fake pioneer humility. Eleanor just tapped her cane on the floor. She reminded him of the freezing damp dirt cellar he offered her when the bank came to collect. He paid in silver. The logging outfit had grown way too big for just 2 folks to run, so they hired hands. Fellas who used to mock Gideon's buckskins and whisper about Eleanor being blind were now begging them for a daily wage. Gideon didn't drive those men with a whip or a shouting match. He kept them in line through terrifying competence. If some greenhorn whined a log was too heavy, Gideon would shoulder it alone, then point that boy right down the road to town. Nobody ever complained twice. One evening, after the final wagon rolled away and the crew cleared out, the old sawmill finally went completely dead quiet. Just the river rushing by. Picture this with me. A gentle roar compared to the violent scream of the buzzsaw. Gideon stood there wiping down those massive iron gears. The man was dog-tired. But it was that deep, satisfying ache in the bones you only get from honest labor. He finally had a roof that held out the rain, a steady fire, and a woman with a backbone of forged iron. Right then, he heard Eleanor's hickory cane tapping the wood planks. She walked from the cabin, but her step was off. Slower, heavy with some kind of burden. Gideon stepped out from under the sled. He saw her holding something long and heavy bundled up tight in a thick wool blanket. "The stagecoach rolled in from Carson City today," Eleanor said. She stopped close by, listening for the scrape of his heavy boots so she knew exactly where he stood. "I sent an order with the driver 3 weeks back." Gideon just wiped his greasy hands on his canvas pants. "We don't need any parts. The gears are holding strong." "It's not parts." She held the heavy bundle out to him. Gideon took it, recognizing the weight before he ever touched the wool. That familiar metallic smell of gun oil and polished curly maple hit the evening air. He threw back the blanket, his old Hawken rifle. The brass patchbox caught the fading western light. There wasn't a single scratch on that heavy iron barrel. It was kept in perfect shape. Gideon just stared at the weapon, then up at Eleanor. Jeremiah Reed wouldn't sell this back for less than $150. He knew what it was. He got $200. Eleanor spoke steady as a rock. I told him to pull it from the bank draft the railroad agents gave me yesterday. They are laying fresh track up north, right through the pass. They bought our entire summer timber yield. Gideon just ran his rough thumb over that percussion hammer. The steel was cold, familiar, and deadly. It was a piece of his soul he thought he sold to pay off Hiram Gable's dirty extortion. He swallowed hard. Listen to me. A mountain man who'd stare down a charging grizzly without blinking suddenly felt a terrifying tight knot in his throat. You didn't have to do this, Gideon rasped out, his deep voice thicker than usual. The sawmill needs that money for winter. Eleanor stepped closer. She reached out those scarred hands, tracing past his thick suspenders until her palms rested dead square over his beating heart. The mill has its cash, she whispered. The mill has a strong foundation. I wanted my husband to have his rifle back. Gideon stared down at her. This wasn't some fragile frontier flower. That woman was forged steel, tall pine, and absolute unbroken will. He laid the heavy gun on the workbench. Then he reached out and held her face in those massive, rough mountain hands. The man didn't ask permission. He just leaned down and kissed her. It was no polite parlor room romance. It was fierce and wild, tasting like raw sawdust, hard sweat, and survival. Eleanor's cane clattered to the floorboards. She reached up, tangling her fingers in his thick, wild beard, pulling him close to anchor herself against his unyielding mass. When they finally broke apart, picture it with me. The sun sinking below that timberline, bruising the western sky in harsh purple and gold. Gideon just rested his forehead right against hers. He breathed in that sharp scent of pine sap and freezing river water clinging to her. They figured we'd freeze, Gideon whispered, his voice a gravelly rumble. Eleanor smiled, her blind eyes fixed on a horizon she didn't even need to see to rightfully own. Let them freeze, she said. We have a fire to build. They stood together in that quiet dusk, two castaways who took a worthless patch of mud and forged a true frontier empire. Way down below, Pine Bluffs stayed buried in all its petty little town squabbles and deep debts. High on the ridge the wheel turned, the river rushed hard, and that mountain man held his blind widow, finally knowing he was standing exactly where he belonged in this wild world. And folks, that is how the wild actually gets tamed. Not with greedy paper deeds, but with forged iron, sweat, and a completely unbreakable will. Eleanor and Gideon did more than build a mill. They built a lasting legacy, right over the ashes of their doubters. If you and I share a love for tales of vengeance, grit, and hard-earned survival, do not let it end here. Hit that like button. Share this history with a friend who appreciates a genuine frontier tale, and subscribe so you never miss a Western story. Tell me down in the comments, what was your absolute favorite moment of Eleanor taking her revenge? See you down the trail.